There comes a moment in life that many people recognize. A quiet moment when something deep inside you finally whispers. Enough. Not because you suddenly stopped caring. Not because you became cold. But because you realized there was nothing left to gain. The conversation no longer leads anywhere. The relationship has become heavier than it is meaningful. The job, the friendship, the situation, it has already taught you everything it came to teach. And in that moment of clarity, whether it arrives slowly over months or strikes you in an instant, you face a choice. You can leave with anger. You can explain yourself. You can defend every decision you've made. You can make sure the other person understands exactly why you're leaving. What hurt you? What they did wrong? And how much it cost you to stay. You can leave behind a speech. You can make your absence impossible to ignore. Or you can simply walk away in silence. And that is where true power begins. Because leaving quietly is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is not the behavior of someone who has lost their voice. When silence comes from inner clarity rather than fear, it becomes one of the strongest expressions of self-respect. There is something strange that happens the moment you decide to leave. The pain isn't new. You've been carrying that for a long time. What surprises you is something else. The overwhelming urge to explain yourself. Suddenly you feel as if every feeling must be justified. Every wound must be described. Every disappointment must be understood. You find yourself writing long messages. Deleting them. Rewriting them. Believing that if you just choose the right words, everything will finally make sense. But then, almost without noticing, something inside you grows tired. A quiet realization appears. Not everyone wants to understand you. Some people decided long ago that they wouldn't. And no explanation will change that. That is when a difficult thought enters your mind. Maybe walking away in silence isn't weakness at all. Maybe, for the very first time, you are finally choosing to respect yourself. The most exhausting part isn't always being hurt. Sometimes, it's feeling as though you still have to explain why it hurt. As if your pain needs evidence before it's allowed to exist. So you try. You carefully choose your words. You rehearse the conversation in your mind over and over again. Maybe if I say it this way, they'll finally understand. You don't want to sound angry. You don't want to be unfair. You don't want to become the villain in someone else's story. So you soften your voice. You edit your emotions. You explain everything with patience. But when the moment finally comes, something feels strangely familiar. They interrupt. They defend themselves. They change the subject. Or perhaps the most painful response of all. They act as though nothing was ever that serious. And suddenly you're left with a heavy feeling. Not because you said too little. But because you said far too much. Have you ever noticed that some conversations never bring peace? No matter how honest you are. No matter how calm you remain. You always walk away feeling more exhausted than before. More confused. Sometimes you even begin questioning yourself. As though expressing your feelings was somehow a mistake. As though trying to be understood required you to betray something much deeper inside yourself. And if you've lived through that, you already know the moment I'm talking about. The moment when you're no longer speaking because you hope to be understood. You're speaking because you don't want to feel guilty for leaving. That is the moment everything changes. Because you suddenly realize something uncomfortable. You aren't searching for understanding anymore. You're searching for permission. Permission to let go. Permission to close the chapter. Permission to choose yourself without someone else questioning your decision. But here's the truth. That permission rarely comes. And while you're waiting for it, you stay longer than you should. Longer than your peace can afford. Longer than your heart quietly knows you need to. There is another truth that is even harder to accept. Sometimes we don't explain ourselves because the other person needs clarity. We explain ourselves because we haven't completely let go. It may sound uncomfortable. But that's often what is really happening. Because if your decision had already become peaceful inside you, you wouldn't feel the need to defend it over and over again. You wouldn't desperately hope that one perfect sentence could finally change everything. But when part of your heart is still attached, when some small part of you still hopes they'll suddenly understand, you keep talking. You keep explaining. You keep waiting. Almost believing that somewhere in that conversation, they'll finally say the one thing you've been longing to hear. And that's where the trap begins. You're no longer trying to end the story. You're trying to rewrite the ending. You're hoping for an apology. For recognition. For closure. For the ending you deserved. But life doesn't always give us that ending. Sometimes, the only closure you'll ever receive is the one you choose for yourself. There is a simple truth that many people spend years trying to avoid. Not every situation deserves an explanation. Not because you have nothing to say, but because not everything deserves your energy. For most of our lives, we're taught that the mature thing to do is to explain ourselves. Clear up misunderstandings. Resolve every conflict. Leave every story with a neat ending. But life doesn't always work that way. Some relationships are never truly resolved. They are simply released. And the sooner you accept that, the lighter your heart becomes. Most people see silence as a sign of weakness. As if saying nothing means you've lost. But there is a kind of silence that has nothing to do with fear. It comes from clarity. It comes from recognizing that continuing the conversation would be like pushing against a door that has already been locked from the inside. At that point, something changes. It isn't anger. It isn't resentment. It isn't giving up. It's something much quieter. You stop forcing what no longer wants to happen. Think about water flowing around a rock. It doesn't argue with the stone. It doesn't try to convince it to move. It doesn't waste its strength fighting something that refuses to change. It simply changes direction. And continues its journey. Calmly. Naturally. Without drama. Without needing to prove anything. That is real strength. Because you're no longer reacting. You're choosing. You're stepping away from a place where you once stayed. Not because you truly wanted to. But because you believed you had to. And even if no one else notices that decision, something inside you changes forever. Imagine a young warrior climbing a mountain. For days, he travels with only one purpose. To defeat the greatest Zen master anyone has ever spoken about. His sword hangs at his side. His mind is filled with pride. He believes that victory will prove his worth. When he finally reaches the mountaintop, he doesn't find a legendary warrior waiting for him. Instead, he sees an old monk quietly sweeping dry leaves outside a small wooden cabin. The mountain is silent. The wind gently moves through the trees. The young man feels confused. Surely, this cannot be the master. He walks forward, drives his sword into the ground, and begins insulting the old monk. He mocks his age, questions his wisdom, challenges his reputation, demands a duel. But the old monk never answers. He simply keeps sweeping. As though the falling leaves deserve more attention than the angry word standing before him. The young warrior grows frustrated. His voice becomes louder. His insults become crueler. Finally he shouts. "What's wrong? Aren't you going to defend yourself? Or are you just a coward?" For the first time, the old monk stops. He slowly looks at the young man. Not with anger. Not with contempt, but with a calmness so deep, it becomes impossible to ignore. Without saying a single word, he places the broom beside the wall, turns around, walks into his cabin, and gently closes the door behind him. He never comes back outside. The young warrior is left standing there, alone with his own anger. He waits. He yells. He kicks the dirt. But nothing happens. And little by little, his rage begins to fade. What once felt like strength slowly turns into something much heavier. Embarrassment. Emptiness. Defeat. Because in that silence, he learned a lesson no words could have taught him. Some battles are lost the moment the other person refuses to fight. You don't have to climb a mountain to learn this lesson. Life gives you opportunities to practice it almost every day. It happens when you explain the same thing for the third time, even though you were perfectly clear the first time. Yet somehow, it's as if the other person is speaking a completely different language. It happens when you write that long message. The one that begins with kindness, but slowly turns into a mixture of exhaustion, self-defense, and goodbye. You read it one last time before hitting send. And something inside you hesitates. Not because the message is wrong. Not because your feelings aren't valid. But because, deep down, you already know it won't change anything. It happens at work. You've voiced your concerns. You've shared your ideas. You've tried to improve the situation. And yet, nothing changes. Still, a part of you feels responsible for giving one final explanation before you leave. As if quietly walking away would somehow be unfair. It happens in friendships, too. You begin noticing that you're always the one reaching out. Always the one checking in. Always the one making plans. Always the one trying to keep the connection alive. Then one day, you stop. And the silence that follows tells you everything you needed to know. It happens in relationships where conversations no longer build understanding. They only create more distance. Every serious discussion ends exactly where the last one did. And after every conversation, you leave feeling strangely empty. Not because you didn't speak, but because you were never truly heard. That is the moment almost no one chooses. The moment to stop explaining. Not because you don't have good reasons, but because you've realized your reasons were never the real problem. The hardest part isn't walking away. The hardest part is resisting the urge to say one more thing before you do. One last message. One final explanation. One more attempt to be understood. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply save the message. Close the conversation. And accept that not everything needs to be said in order to be true. Because something remarkable happens when you stop insisting. Your energy begins to return. The energy that was once spent defending yourself. Justifying your choices. Repeating the same truth over and over again. For the first time in a long while. You're no longer trying to change someone else. You're finally beginning to free yourself. But there's something important to understand. Not every silence comes from wisdom. And if you don't recognize the difference, you may mistake avoidance for peace. There is a silence that comes from the ego. It's the silent treatment. The kind of silence that secretly hopes the other person will notice. Will chase after you. Will apologize. Will finally understand what they did. It says, I'm not going to say anything, but I want you to figure everything out on your own. That isn't peace. It's control wearing the mask of silence. The conversation may have ended. But the emotional battle is still happening inside you. Real silence feels completely different. It doesn't wait for an apology. It doesn't hope for revenge. It doesn't need to be understood. It asks for nothing. Because something inside you has already finished the conversation. Not because the experience no longer matters. But because you've accepted that continuing to fight for understanding no longer serves your life. There is no strategy. No hidden message. No desire to win. Only one quiet decision. I've done all I could. Now it's time to move forward. And when you leave from that place, everything changes. You stop looking back to see if they noticed. You stop wondering whether they'll finally understand someday. You simply keep walking. Yes. It may still hurt. But you're no longer carrying the heavy burden of needing to explain your piece to someone who was never willing to protect it in the first place. Some goodbyes don't make a sound. There are no dramatic arguments. No emotional speeches. Sometimes there isn't even one final conversation. There is only a quiet moment when something inside you finally settles. And you realize you don't have to stay anymore. From the outside, it may seem cold. Some people may even call it selfish. But inside, it feels completely different. It feels like setting down a burden you've been carrying for so long that you forgot what life felt like without it. Like finally releasing a rope you've been pulling for years. Only to discover it was never connected to anything at all. Perhaps that's what many people never understand. Sometimes you don't leave because you stopped loving. You leave because you finally started loving yourself. There is an old Zen teaching that says the wisest masters rarely needed long speeches. They didn't spend their lives trying to convince people. They didn't argue with every misunderstanding. They simply lived their truth. And when it was time to leave, they left. Sometimes their silence taught more than words ever could. We often believe our voice is our greatest source of power. But that isn't always true. Sometimes your greatest power is knowing when to stop speaking. When to stop proving. When to stop chasing understanding from people who have already chosen not to listen. At first, it won't feel easy. There will be days when you'll want to go back. To send one more message. To explain one more time. To tell them the one thing you forgot to say. That's normal. The heart doesn't let go overnight. But if you allow yourself to remain in that silence, without filling it with guilt, without trying to justify your decision, something beautiful begins to happen. Your mind becomes quieter. Your body feels lighter. Your energy slowly returns. And one day, almost without realizing it, you stop looking over your shoulder. Because the goal was never to make everyone understand why you left. The goal was to reach a place where you no longer needed to explain it. That is a kind of peace no argument can take away. Before we finish, I'd like to leave you with one simple question. Think about a moment in your life when you felt you had to explain yourself. A moment when you gave too much of your time. Too much of your energy. Too many words. And nothing changed. If you feel comfortable, share it in the comments below. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be long. Just make it honest. Sometimes reading another person's story reminds us that we're not alone. And sometimes writing it down is the final step toward letting it go. If this message spoke to your heart, don't rush to the next video just yet. Stay here for one more moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice what's happening inside you. Because often, the most important transformation doesn't happen during the noise. It begins in the silence. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this video brought you clarity, consider subscribing and joining our journey into timeless Zen wisdom, inner peace, and spiritual growth. Until next time, take care of your mind. Protect your peace. And remember, not every battle is won by fighting. Sometimes, the greatest victory is quietly walking away.